Alright, welcome back to Only Divergences. Today we're going to take a look at Roku. And I'm going to be updating this video in the future, so subscribe to know when I see potential divergence here, some bullish divergence. But right now, I don't see strong potential for bullish divergence based on what I'm looking at from the technicals and the just the back testing that I've seen. So before we start, however, I have to ask you to let YouTube know that I'm giving you a unique perspective on markets. You can do that by liking this video or by subscribing and holding me accountable, because I'm going to put my money where my mouth is for a lot of this. Okay, so let's just take a look at Roku, and we noticed that the stock was, let's just take the March lows as a starting point. Stock rose, and then it just really went on a strong tear here. And you can see that it was in a very thin trend. So you can see that there was very little pullback. There was quite a bit of pullback, but it really continued higher. And on the weekly chart, you can see that generally it stayed above either the 5 or the 10-week moving average. So this was a very strong, but very thin trend, right? And when you have thin trends, well, you get really strong pullbacks, but there's other things that you get as well, and we're going to take a look at that. So it ended mid-February. And interesting thing is that it ended on negative daily divergence. So what am I talking about here? Well, a negative divergence is when you have a momentum indicator that is lower than its previous high. So you can see here, the MACD was open here. It was pushing higher here. You can see the positive histogram. And then you had a second positive histogram, but that positive histogram, the second one, was lower than this one. So that usually indicates a shift in momentum or a divergence in momentum, especially when you have an equal price, a higher price, but lower momentum. It means turning around, and that's exactly what happened. Here we had a pullback, and it came down, but then again it rose on this time bullish divergence. But this divergence wasn't very clean, as you can see, because this low was actually a bit lower than this one. But the way that it did bounce was sufficient for it to continue higher, but then it finally did continue fully higher with this divergence here. So you can see finally, after it moved higher, it came back down, and you had basically an equal price here. Right, you can see price was equal, but momentum here was a bit higher. So momentum was shifting on a daily time frame here. So, and another support level, which should be obvious to many of you, this black line here is the 200-day moving average. So it did cut below it a couple times. This was around earnings here, but then it eventually resolved to the upside, and then you had a big break up here. Then what happened? Well, then you had another instance of negative daily divergence. So you can see here, the momentum indicator is lower than the previous one, but price is higher. That indicates that momentum has shifted. And instead of going higher, that move is now over and it's going lower. But what's more important is that this is daily divergence, but it's also strong weekly divergence. So you can see that this big Roku trend that we had here, which ended, as I just described, and then it bounced, you have one high here and a subsequent high that is of the same price, but then you have momentum high here, and you have a momentum high that is lower than the previous high in momentum, thus indicating a shift or a divergence in the momentum. I just showed you 2 times, 3 times actually, how momentum divergence plays out. Now we're seeing it on a larger time frame. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're likely going to move a lot lower with Roku before we can find our footing, so to speak. We can see that since that negative divergence happened, there have been a lot of red days. A lot of red days. The only green candle that we saw was really this one, which was an earnings gap fill. So the stock still ended low, it ended negative, even though this was a green candle. Then really no other green candles. A little bit of a bounce here. We came here, and what happened here? Well, this was really interesting. This is why I use the average true range to conduct some analysis when I'm doing this. You can see average true range was really low. The thing about average true range is that it goes from periods of low to periods of high. And when it's been coming down for some time, you can usually expect some sort of a release. Now, this stock was not forming any sort of strong bullish divergence. The stock wanted to go lower because we had this bearish divergence playing itself out. But it couldn't just do it this way. So it had to have one day, a release to the top, that came down, and now the negative trend can continue. Take a look at the hourly. We can see the tightness in the ATR right before we move higher here. Notice how low the ATR reading is, or was that day. See how this day it was very low. If we go all the way back, we can see that that low reading was actually the lowest reading it's been in a very, very long time. In fact, we're going all the way back to April, and that remains, well, with maybe this exception here, it remains one of the lowest readings. So what happens when you have low readings? Well, you need releases to the upside, and that's what, well, you need releases. Depends on how that's going to happen. Well, we saw it happen here, and then it came down. So not a lot of sustained moves. Now, if you want to play options, you can do that, and you can play this really well if you know how to time it. Not a lot of sustained moves. So what are we seeing now? Well, what we're seeing now is a situation where a lot of people are underwater with ROKU, right? Because they bought either here, or here, or here. If you bought in any of these areas, you're underwater. And we just hit a bearish divergence. So this is the context that we're in. We have no trend. There's no upward trend here. We're actually in a downward trend. We're below the moving averages. We have a weekly negative divergence. And we're now below the 200-day moving average. And it looks like the average, first of all, is flattening out. And when that happens, usually there's moves lower. So the goal of this video is really just to provide objective technicals. Looking at this chart, using absolutely no narrative or news, because I believe that that's already priced in. So we're taking a look at what is effectively objective, aggregate market behavior over time. So what does this mean? Well, I'm looking for bullish divergences, as I've said many times before. Only looking for bullish divergences. What I would want is an example of past instances where we've had bullish divergences before. So when was the last time we had a really strong bullish divergence? I think around here was a good move. Could have bought at the close. Here was a nice bullish divergence. Here was a nice bullish divergence. And what did all those instances have? Well, we had elevated green that was rising relatively fast, and we had low red. Elevated green, not the fastest rise, but low red. Elevated green, low red. Our green isn't that elevated, neither is our red. I cannot see an instance where this type of a setup on the daily results in a nice green candle here. That's simply not going to happen. Could there be bounces? Possibly. But if we look at the hourly as well, we notice that this doesn't show a strong bullish divergence either. And that would be in line with our view that ROKU, having hit a weekly, long-term negative divergence, needs to go lower before it gets attractive for entry. What does that mean? Well, it means we're probably going to see ROKU drop to 300 or lower. In fact, it's very likely that ROKU is going to come down to this 300 level before it gets a bounce, but I would assume that it would get a bounce from this level. However, that bounce is going to likely be rejected. The stock still needs to get its footing, and it's having a very hard time doing so. I anticipate that there will be opportunities to buy ROKU on a counter-trend rally in less than 3 weeks. I will keep an eye on ROKU, and I will update you. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe so you can get my videos. Take care.